There has been close to a decade and a half of dysfunction at DC Comics. Now, a lot of people think that the New 52, which started in 2011, was the start of all the dysfunction in the DC universe. However, anybody who understands what happens behind the scenes in the comic book industry understands that what led to the decade and a half of dysfunction at DC Comics actually started in 2004. And in 2002 or 2004, a man known as Dan Didio was hired to be the editor in chief at DC Comics. And what happened with Mr. Dido was he has an extensive Hollywood background, doing television and television shows like Reboot and other things like that. But he has no publishing experience. And because he has no publishing experience, he doesn't really understand how to navigate a universe of characters and a catalog of characters. Now, you see, Warner Brothers, the parent company of DC Comics, probably thought, that this guy could synergize because he has a television background and he could be able to adapt the characters. However, when it comes down to comic books and publishing, you really have to have a solid publishing background in order to understand how to navigate a large catalog of characters, such as over 3,000 characters in the DC universe. And Mr. Dido has pretty much shown he does not understand, how to manage that universe of characters, because I looked at, his background and he wasn't a good fit for it. And his decisions pretty much show that he doesn't really understand how to manage a universe of characters, because, in fantasy, that a lot of people don't understand, that there are different concepts, and a lot of the people who are like Mr. Dido, Dan Dido, don't understand that a universe of characters is completely different from a world of characters. And the same thing with the person who replaced Jeanette Kahn, Diana Nelson. She managed the Harry Potter world, the Harry Potter franchise, and she was brought into DC Comics, and also she's not qualified really to manage the DC universe because she doesn't understand, the complexity of it. And I'm going to explain that right now, because you have to come from a publishing background and a writing background to understand the differences between a world and a universe. The world of Harry Potter is just one world, and 95% of the world revolves around Harry Potter, and it's a single self-contained entity. Whereas a universe is multiple characters, and all these stories are going on at the exact same time. And you have to be able to manage all of those as an editor in chief. You have to be able to manage all of those worlds that are going on at the exact same time. That means you have to be a really effective communicator with multiple writers. You have to be an effective communicator with multiple editors. You have to be able to, make sure that what's going on in one title does not, is consistent with what's going on in another title, and that everything, lines up together. And both of these people at the top really don't understand how there is a difference between a world and a universe. And that's why the DC universe completely fell apart over the last 10, 15, almost 15 years. It fell apart because, they don't have the publishing experience or the publishing background to understand how a universe is managed. Now, somebody who was watched stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek, I understand, what a universe is, because a universe, again, is multiple characters having their stories and they're all going on at the same time. For example, like in Empire Strikes Back, Luke was on Dagobah with Yoda. Meanwhile, Han Solo, at the same time, was with Princess Leia, and they were trying to evade the Imperial forces and trying to make their way to Cloud City. Now, while both of these stories were going on, Darth Vader was on the hunt, and that's how a universe works. And all the stories, they line up. They're all going on at the same time, but eventually they all eventually lead up to the climax, where after Luke has his epic lightsaber battle and Han is in the carbonite, it all leads up to the conclusion where, after Luke discovers Darth Vader is his father, they go on to have the next story, which is Return of the Jedi. But that's what happens in the universe. And Star Trek is almost the same thing. It's a universe of characters. You have Kirk who's having his story going on, or Picard who's having his story going on, which is usually the main story. Then you have a subplot which is going on with usually Riker or Worf or one of those other characters. And both of these stories are going on at the same time in the same episode. But when you're in a world, you only have one story going on. But when you're in a universe, you have multiple stories going on. And when you have a universe of titles, you have like at least 25 to 30 stories going on at the exact same time, and all the stories have to be consistent and congruent with each other. You just can't have the Joker appear in a Batman comic and then show up all of a sudden in a Flash comic if Batman has captured him and put him in Arkham Asylum. You just can't have that happen without a proper or reasonable explanation. And when you look at DC Comics today, the universe is not consistent, it's not even, and a lot of the storytelling, is just not there because the editorial really does not understand how to work within a universe model. The universe model is very, very different, and it's a challenge to work with because I've been working with it, with this building the SJS Direct universe in fantasy fiction for the last 10 years. I've been building this universe, and I understand the complexity of it. I understand, what has to be done to navigate all these characters because the world of ISIS and the world of John Haynes right now and the world of East-Team are all going on at the same time when I tell stories. So what happens in an ISIS story directly and indirectly affects what's going on in a John Haynes story sometimes, and what's happening in an East-Team story directly and indirectly affects what's happening in an ISIS story, or if I ever get to the Temptation of John Haynes sequel, all of that affects what's happening in another story. And sometimes when I'm doing, historical continuity, like a novel like The Thetas, which features another character, Colleen, who was pledging the sorority, I have to make sure that everything lines up there, so that the past history directly lines up with what's going on in the timeline of the present. Because when I wrote The Thetas, I put in a little Easter egg where there's one of the pictures, and Isis is one of the founders of the Thetas, and that's what I used as the gateway to start the Modern ISIS series with, because I needed to make sure that the timeline fit, because I had to take the character from 1880 all the way to today, and that was a challenge. And the only way I could do that was with that Easter egg that I put in the novel The Thetas, and that was what I used as the gateway because it tied directly into the foundation I had established in The Temptation of John Haynes, a book I published in 2011, where when I brought the East-Team character back, and she was stuck in 1880, but I brought her back in a short called The Politics of Hell, and then I really established her in the novel Temptation of John Haynes, and that opened the door for the ISIS character to come in, and all the continuity had to flow seamlessly, and that's not happening at DC Comics. They so focused on continuity that they keep rebooting their universes to try to fix things, but when when you focus too much on continuity, it prevents you from making stories. It really is a sign that your creators are frustrated and really don't understand the craft of storytelling because editorial is not directing them properly to understand that sometimes continuity is not something that you have to focus on too much all the time. If you understand what direction your stories are going in, it's not a problem, because I haven't really had a problem in building the SJS Direct universe over the last, since 2002, and with the first ISIS book, which I published. This is the first ISIS book that I published in 2002, and I haven't had a problem going back and forth into the continuity. But I look at the DC universe, over 3,000 characters, and it's been a complete mess because the people at the top really don't understand, the universe model of storytelling. And you have to really understand how to navigate all those characters and navigate all those stories. And it's a clear sign to me, all the events and all the retcons and all this stuff and all the stuff leading into the New 52. It shows me that no one really at the top understands how to navigate a universe or how the universe model works. And it really shows me that a lot of people are frustrated, and this is why they keep rebooting the universe or going in with gimmicks, because a good storyteller can just pick their story points and go from there, because that's what I had to do when I did this novel, Temptation of John Haynes. I had to I had to pick my story points from the first ISIS book, from the Politics of Hell, and then I had to fuse it with the concepts I wanted to do for the new John Haynes story. I had to pick those elements that I wanted to. I had to pick the elements that I wanted to tell, and then I used that as a foundation for my story. And eventually, I used that because the Temptation of John Haynes is like the cornerstone of the SJS Direct universe, and because again, this book brings the East Team into the modern age, and it opens the door for ISIS to come in. This, along with the Thetas, opens the door for her to come into the modern ISIS series, which starts with Amari's Revenge here. And that's how I started laying the foundation for the SJS Direct universe. But when I look at the DC universe, they rebooted the entire universe in 2011, and they're still having the same problems, and nobody's looking at it and saying, you're still having the same problems, but your editorial hasn't changed, and the editorial has been making mistakes since 2004. And I look at, the story Identity Crisis as the start of all of this dysfunction. Some people will say it's the Teen Titans story where Donna Troy was killed was a start, but I really look at Identity Crisis as the start of the decade and a half of dysfunction at DC Comics. I look at that story, and it was a story that if I were an editor-in-chief, it would have gotten a kill fee and had never been published, because the story did devastating damage to the DC Comics brand, and I can clearly see where it did devastating damage, because I think that they got more caught up in the gimmick of having this New York Times best-selling author, Brad Meltzer, writing a story rather than focusing on how the story would directly impact, how the universe would be, damaged by it. Because I look at the precedent set by that story, and it sets the tone for the decade and a half of dysfunction. In the Identity Crisis, the story starts with the murder of the elongated man's wife, Sue Dibney, and eventually, after this horrific murder, the woman is burned to death, and it's just horrifying stuff that happens to her. They soon find out that a villain, Dr. Light, came into the Justice League satellite, raped her, and then the other heroes find out, and these events happen back in the 1970s. It's what they call satellite era of the Justice League, and a couple of the heroes find out, and they decide to, instead of comfort a friend, which is what DC heroes usually do, because DC heroes are usually beacons of, your role models, and they are beacons of truth and stuff like that. Instead, they decide to do something unethical, which is erase the memory of Dr. Light, wipe the memory of Sue Dibney, and then Batman finds out, they wipe his memory, and from there, it's like a domino effect. Instead of heroes, being in this black and white world, because the DC universe is a black and white world, and when I was growing up as a 4-year-old kid, this is what I saw with the DC universe. This is what was presented to me when I would look at comics in my brother's comic book collection when I was 4 years old, and as I got older, and as I looked at old DC comics, and everything in Identity Crisis, which they were making a so-called main canon story with this retcon story, which is retroactive continuity, just didn't fit. And I have been reading these comics, since I was about 4 years old, and everything just didn't fit. And I looked at it and I said, this is why I can say this book should have never been published, because it's just not consistent with what the way the characters were acting, in old Justice League comics. When I look at the story and I said, Green Lantern wouldn't be able to keep his ring if he went in with a scheme like this. Because again, Green Lanterns have to be completely honest and totally fearless. And by him being completely dishonest, he would have lost his ring. And the Flash, being a police officer, I doubt he would have wanted to participate in this type of cover up. Same thing with Hawkman. He's also a police officer, and I doubt he would want to participate in this type of cover up. Again, it's just out of character. And same thing with Green Arrow, because he's a liberal and he believes in, making sure everybody has their day in court and making sure everything is about, making sure everything is right and that the man doesn't get over on somebody. He wouldn't participate in this, and I just don't see Zatanna erasing memories to cover up something like this. I just don't see it. Again, from all the comics that I've read over the past, back in the 70s and the 80s when I was a little boy, the actions of the characters just weren't consistent with the actions of the characters in comics previous. And the story just didn't work. Now, a lot of comic fans today would go, "Oh, that was an exciting story," or "You don't get it," but I get it. I've been reading these comics for over 30 years, so I understood why this story didn't work, and I understood, you know, editorial made a bunch of mistakes. And when I heard Mr. Dan Didio say that, we need a rape in the story, that's kind of turned my stomach, because this is comics again are a family entertainment, and there's no place for this type of violence in a comic. Now I've seen it, at Marvel. They did this, in a West Coast Avengers story where a Mockingbird was raped, and it's like in between the lines. They didn't put it up front like that, and it kind of just slipped through because of the way they executed it. But this, the heroes, it really tarnished the DC heroes and really soured the DC brand. Because instead of these black and white heroes who were paragons of right and wrong, DC Universe turned into a gray area. And from there, the whole universe just fell apart, because instead of us getting stories about heroes who stand for what is right and doing what is right all the time, even if they lose, they still stand for what they believe in. What we got were, this gray area where there's no good, there's no evil, people just do whatever they want. It's kind of similar to what happened in the Mark Waid, Alex Ross graphic novel Kingdom Come. And in Kingdom Come, there was no good, there was no evil, and people just did whatever they wanted. It was just total anarchy. And from there, I look at the DC Universe, and it just fell apart, because instead of us getting that black and white world of good and evil, and good always triumphs over evil, we got, gory murders, gory violence. I look at the death of the Blue Beetle and how this well-liked, popular character was just shot in the head. We got, Wonder Woman snapping Maxwell Lord's neck. We got all sorts of mutilations, like in Infinite Crisis. And the DC heroes, again, they went from these paragons of good and evil to these violent predators who just did whatever they wanted. It was almost like watching that episode. I remember one episode of Justice League where they had featured these evil versions of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman called the Justice Lords. And they felt, we have to do what is in the best interest of people, when they really were just doing what was in the best interest of themselves. It was just do whatever I want, and no sense of order, no sense of justice. Their brand of justice, made them just as bad as the bad guys. And this is what the DC Universe has devolved into under the leadership of your Dan Didio and your Diane Nelson. And this is because they're not qualified and have no understanding of how to navigate a universe of characters. Because when you understand how to tell stories in a universe, you don't have to resort to gimmicks, stunts, and, countless events. This is another big problem with the DC universe and the DC brand, is that they can't go, 6 or 7 months with a title just standing on its own. So for example, a Superman title just can't have his own stories where it's just Superman facing his bad guys, or Batman just in Gotham City facing his bad guys all by himself. Now, most stories usually are just tied into these big events like your Blackest Night or your Infinite Crisis, and that really, I really believe that that type of event model. Now, this started in the '80s, the event model. I really think that in 2015, the event model is obsolete, and it's really bogging down stuff and preventing writers from really getting creative, and it really slows down, people's runs. But at DC Comics, they desperately need the event model because a lot of their creators really don't understand how to tell their own stories. They really aren't given the space to tell their own stories, and that's paramount in building a comic book brand or even building a fantasy brand. Is that each character has to have their own voice and their own stories and their own story models. And this was something that I learned, over the last decade, writing different characters and writing different stories. That each character's book has to be their own book. It has to have their own feel, its own feel. The character has to have its own voice. It has to have its own story model and its own, way of doing things. I mean, what happens for me in SJS Direct is what happens in an ISIS story. The model is completely different from what goes on in an E-Steam story. And what happens in, say, a book like All About Maryland back here is completely different from what happens in an All About Nikki. Now, both books are tied together, but each book has its own story model, and each character has their own voice, and everything, you know, makes it distinct. And when you read a DC comic, you just don't feel that because everything is just in this big event. And to cover up the inability to tell stories, they use these shock stunts, where this gory graphic violence, like these mutilations, decapitations, and other things to cover up the inability to tell a good story. Now, they may have a premise there, but it's just covered up, and you really don't get to the plot points, and it's not really compelling because when you've read a really good story, like I have, you understand where this stuff works. And if you've written stories like I have and, studied storytelling, you understand how to put this stuff together. And you don't really need, stuff like cutting a guy's arm off or shooting a guy in the head. You don't need stuff like that to be your plot point. You can make your plot point, first plot point, something as simple as somebody finding a note, or your first plot point, something like, let me think, somebody seeing somebody. That's your plot point. Because these are plot points that I have used in the past in different stories, or the hero having a confrontation with the villain. That's your plot point. And when you understand the craft of storytelling, you can meet those plot points without using a gimmick, and you can also hit the climax without using a gimmick, and you can also conclude a story without using a gimmick or a shock. Because what I find from my almost decade and a half, more than a decade and a half, almost 20 years of writing experience is that you know what's going to get the reader's attention is a great plot, a great premise, good character voices, great character development. But when you look at today's comics, you really don't see that. You just see a lot of shock stunts, a lot of gimmicks. Now, now superheroes are supposed to be brightly colored, imaginative worlds, but I don't see much imagination anymore. I don't see much creativity. I just see, people just going through the motions and coming up with a shock stunt to just get to the next issue instead of just saying, you know what, we need to move this forward with a really solid story. And storytelling, again, it's a craft. And when you understand the craft of storytelling, again, you don't need gimmicks. I mean, I've seen some great strips from artists outside of DC, like Yale Stewart's JL8 or Bill Wackel's The Hero Business, and they don't have to kill anybody or blow anybody's heads off or tear out hearts. They don't need gore, because that's another big problem for me with the Dido era at DC Comics is just all of this gore, all of this violence, excessive violence. I mean, some of this stuff, this is the kind of stuff I look at the content, in most modern comics, and it's almost like it was before they had those Senate hearings in the 1950s. Just the content is just way over the top. It's way overdone, and you know, because there's a fine line between good taste and just obscenity, and I feel that the Dido era has crossed into the line of obscenity, especially with with this, and it just overdoes it. Because I've just looked at too many comic panels of mutilations, um, decapitations, eviscerations. I mean, this is not stuff you could give to a kid. And when you think about what the DC Comics brand used to be and what it stood for, how it was a family brand, people always felt safe, sharing these type of comics with their kids. And you see what it is today. It just disturbs you. And I look at this brand, and it's just disturbing. I mean, these aren't heroes. These aren't people that kids could look up to, adults could look up to. I mean, this is what I had growing up with the DC Comics brand. This is why I say there's been a decade and a half of dysfunction. Because again, when you hire a person who does not understand, the publishing business or how to market products for children, and they're in a leadership position, you have a problem. And then I look at guys like Jim Lee who were running comics in the '90s, and and Bob Harris, they're using an archaic 1990s model to sell comics in 2015, and I'm like, none of these guys understood that the publishing world collapsed in 2008, and that there's a different model. Because I was reading a New York magazine back when I was, working at this college library, and they talked about how the publishing world completely collapsed in 2008. And this was due to a lot of inexperienced editors working at publishing houses. They were giving out $1 million advances to people, and for first novels, usually a first novel you only get about $5,000 to $6,000, but they were giving out $1 million advances on 900-page novels. They weren't really thinking about discounts, and this all led to the collapse of the publishing industry. And I'm looking at the DC Comics, and they're not really focused on building a new model because a lot of their people, again, have no experience, one. And two, you have people who are still stuck in the 1990s in terms of stories and story paradigms in the executive on the executive level. You really have to adapt your model to relate to today. And today's model is completely different than it was in the 1990s or even the early 2000s, because again, the early 2000s, again, completely different world. Post 2008 publishing world has to really compete with the internet, television, film, and it also has to. That means you have to create products that um, can get people's attention and keep their attention, because they have a lot of things competing for it. So you need to really create a different type of product, and that's not being done at your DC Comics. Not, and I only really think it's being done at Marvel Comics on the publishing side. The publishing side really is not focusing on different products. Like what I've seen, web comics, or even Kindle exclusive comics, because you have this vast catalog, and I look at it and I say, you really need to have these type of products, but they're not being produced at DC Comics. They'd rather just, what I've seen for the last 3 years, continue to launch titles really without a concrete plan. Again, because this guy has no publishing experience, he doesn't understand that you just can't keep launching titles and then replacing them. Because what they did for the last 3 years with this new 52 was they continued to keep launching titles to make up 52 titles, not understanding that in the publishing business, every time you launch a title, that costs money. And each title that fails, again, because you're in a universe model, when one of these titles fails, each story you've told has a direct impact on other stories. So when you cancel a title, it may affect what happens in another book, even if the story is self-contained. If there were events that tied into another story, they may affect those characters. And more importantly, people who were buying that book, they get frustrated, because what happens is you start buying a title, you start getting into it, because I've seen this happen, even back when I was collecting comics. Um, you start getting into a title, you start buying it regularly, sometimes you even subscribe to it. Then all of a sudden you find out the title is is taken, canceled, and that really frustrates you because you really wanted to keep buying this title, and it's not there anymore. And then you don't want to go out and buy a replacement title, or you just get frustrated because you go, I keep buying these books and they keep getting canceled, and there's no incentive for the person to buy in when you have a title that's ongoing. This is why, I learned that you have to be very selective about what books you launch, because people start getting into a book, and then all of a sudden you pull the rug out from under them. It becomes a problem. And this is a big problem at DC Comics, is that they kept launching titles really without a concrete plan for where they wanted to go with them over the next 24, 36 months. Because when you're doing a series like I did with the ISIS series, you really have to have an outline and a plan for where you want to go for 24, 36 months in terms of stories. And I remember back in 2002 when I said, in the first ISIS book here, um, I said I wanted to start a series. And I originally planned for this book, Amari's Revenge, to come out in 2004. And but I wasn't in the right state to write that story. And unfortunately, I didn't even have the universe foundation set to write that story, because ISIS, again, is set in 1880, and Amari's Revenge is set today. And I really needed to create that timeline, and I didn't have the tools to build a timeline yet. And it took me several years to learn how universes work. And I'm a guy who studied the Marvel Universe, the DC Universe backwards and forwards, um, all throughout high school and college. I mean, I have books like Origins of Marvel Comics, Son of Origins, and other books in my drawer. And I studied and books like Superhero Women in my drawer in my bedroom. So I have been studying comics, and the comic story model, in addition to other types of story models, because I read Sid Field's screenplay and Robert McKee's story, and I learned that, and I also learned novel writing. So I learned different story models and different approaches to storytelling, and even then, I still have to learn, how the comic book story model works, because that's a learning curve, and because you have to learn how to put that much story in 32 pages. I mean, not 32 pages, but 20 pages. You have to really learn how to put, write those descriptions so that the artist knows how to translate them into panels. And again, that's another problem I see with a lot of, comics today. A lot of writers, they really don't understand, the craft of storytelling, because it's a completely different story model. And this is the big problem. Another big problem at DC Comics that I see on the business side is that you have people thinking that novels, screenplays, and comics are all the same type of storytelling, when they're absolutely not the same type of storytelling. Your novel is, again, descriptions and prose, and you have to make sure that your narration, is very compelling, and that your characters have good voices and your dialogue is good. Whereas your screenplay, you can't use as many words. There's a rule in screenwriting saying that you have to tell the most amount of story with the minimum amount of words, and I had to do that, with All About Marilyn here. I had to learn how to do that with the screenplay, and I had to learn how to do it again when I was writing television scripts for this All About Nikki. And I had to learn how to do that with Marilyn. I had to learn how to do it in a feature model, which is 120, 130, 120, 110 pages. And in Nikki, I had to learn how to do it, for television, which is usually about 20 pages, because in a screenplay, it's about a minute is one page. So I had to learn how to do that and make it effective, because your average TV show, is about 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, and that's even with commercial breaks. So you got to learn how to do that, work within those, parameters. And your comic is also completely different from scripts that I've read and taken a look at. And in a comic model, each panel is described in a certain way, and then You have the sound dialogue at the bottom, and then the sound effects, and then you move forward. You have to make sure that you tell a complete story in about 20 pages, and that can be a bit of a challenge if you really don't understand, how the model works. And it's a learning curve, I can tell you, because when I was transitioning from novels to screenwriting, it was a bit of a challenge to learn how to use the least amount of dialogue to move a story forward. And then I had to adapt that, and I took it later on, and I took it and used what I learned from screenwriting to do other novels, and it proved to have a very, very powerful effect, on my writing. It had a very positive impact on my writing because I was writing shorter paragraphs with shorter prose. Um, the dialogue was moving a lot quicker because I was using less dialogue to tell more story, and and the readers responded to it very positively. And this is something that you, as a writer, have to learn. And I've worked with novels and screenplays and teleplays, and when I look at the comics, I don't really see that because I look at a lot of panel work these days. You get a lot of splash pages, but you don't get the multi-panel thing pictures that really move a story along like I've seen in old 1980s DC comics or even 1970s DC comics. Because when you have a good panel, it really has a lot of action. It really moves the story forward. Even the comic covers, they really don't tell that much of a story. It's just people posed or something. It just doesn't tell a strong enough story. And this is what leads into this. That's why I say it's a decade and a half of dysfunction. I mean, no one really understands, the craft of comics anymore at DC Comics because, again, the leadership never had any experience with comics. They really don't understand, the business of publishing. They really don't understand the business of marketing and promoting comics because marketing and promoting comics, again, completely different than marketing and promoting even novels or fantasy novels. Now, they're all sold in the same store. This is another problem with the Warner Brothers that I understand. All this stuff is sold in the same store, but each one requires a different approach to marketing. I mean, when I'm doing a screenplay book like You're All About Marilyn or You're All About Nikki here, I use a different marketing approach than I would for a fantasy book like Amari's Revenge, or let's see here, or Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. I use very different marketing approaches. Now I may use same techniques like Kindle Unlimited promotion, but I use different approaches and I approach different audiences. When it came down to marketing All About Maryland, I went for a large audience of women, whereas when I went for a book like Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I went for a large comic fan audience or fantasy audience because there are different audiences and even in comics. There's what I've learned is there's a fantasy audience, there's a sci-fi audience, there's a new group that I just found out about last year called superhero prose fiction. These are people who read books like your Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. It's basically like a comic book, but in a novel format or a you know ebook format, and they like to read action and adventure like that. Um, there's your paranormal romance groups, and I often market books like The Temptation of John Haynes here. I market books like this to paranormal romance fans, um, and I try to cross market, different books to different audiences in the hopes that I can pick up those casual readers. And this is one of the things that I've learned, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, is that there are casual readers out there who want to pick up different books and will try different genres, but because the comic book industry has been so insular during this slump over the last 20 years, you know, they're not reaching those new readers. And I look at DC Comics and I see all these opportunities that they could have had if they would just get their content together, because this is why I say they need a seasoned and experienced publishing professional to, navigate their brand and start focusing on the rebuilding of it because the brand really needs to be rebuilt from all the damage that's done. It's been a decade and a half of dysfunction, and there's no real vision to take it into the 21st century. I mean, I listened to what Darwin Cook said a week ago, when he said that comics really crossed the line in 2000. I had to agree with him. I mean, here we are in one of the biggest baby booms, and I've said this, in my own analysis of the comic book industry's issues. It's an ebook I wrote back in 2011 that, we're in the biggest baby boom since World War II, yet kids aren't picking up comics and they're finding other stuff to read. I mean, they can read an 800-page Harry Potter book, but nobody's touching superheroes. And they can also go over and watch Marvel Studios movies like The Avengers and give those movies $1 billion. But nobody's really at DC really understands how to reach kids. Now, DC Heroes at one time they had pretty much dominated the film market with Superman the movie, the original 1989 Batman, even the 1966 Batman. But I'm just one. It's like everything has gotten so dark and angry, and here we are. We have the largest audience of kids, and we're not. There's no way at DC they're not really reaching them. I mean, I even look at how the DC Universe action figures fell apart over the last couple of years with the DC Universe Classics line and how that collapsed. I mean, it was sad to watch that because I saw it happen right in front of me in a Kmart on 34th Street. I was in the Kmart. I was looking for some DC Universe Classic figures because I am a toy collector. I've been collecting superhero action figures for years. And I'm in the aisle, and they have this WWE end cap, and the guys my age, I was about 35, 36 at the time, we're looking at the DC Universe Classics, yet the kids and the mothers were over at the WWE end cap. And they were looking for different characters. And I also saw it happen, in a Toys R Us at 2010. Again, DC Universe Classics, all the superheroes were on one aisle, and the aisle one aisle down at the Gateway Center in the Bronx, all the kids and the mothers were over there. And the sad part was they also had a rack of comics over at this Toys R Us at the Gateway Center, and no kids were even bothering to touch them because, again, the content was just too graphic, too adult, and just out of their touch. And again, the reason why this content is out of touch is because you have an editorial that really does not understand, how or to form a vision to develop the brand. Because if you have no publishing experience, you really don't understand that the content that is used to reach all ages audiences is completely different than what's being produced today. What's being produced today is what I call, what I've heard from numerous message boards is this comics grow up with you mentality, and that's a dysfunctional mentality because a comic book character is not designed to grow up with you. It's just like saying Cookie Monster has to grow up with you. The comic book, as it always stood, historically, has always been a product designed to help children navigate through life. It's just like, your children's book characters, like your Curious George or your, Richard Scarry characters. They help you navigate through life and help you deal with problems that, children face in life, And the superhero also gives people, that sense of community, that sense of understanding that, you are have a responsibility in a bigger world. And that's something that has always been, paramount to the whole superhero model, is that the superhero is a guy with special powers and special abilities, and he believes that, I'm supposed to share with others my powers and my gifts with others to make society better and to make the community better. This is something that your hero was always about, because it was always about instilling those type of values. But when you look at your DC Comics heroes who are now muddled in this gray area, there is no sense of community. There is no sense of obligation to others or commitment to others, and there is no sense, of helping kids navigate through life or helping even adults navigate through life. When I read most comics, or I look at most comics when I would go to a place like a Jim Hanley's Universe or a Barnes & Noble I just saw a bunch of angry loners, complaining, hating their lives, being bitter, feeling like a sense of entitlement. They had entitlement issues. Oh, I have to do this, or I have an obligation, or I just got to do this. It's like this is the superheroes came out of the concept of volunteering because there were people like volunteer firefighters back in the time and other stuff. And the whole concept was about people coming out and using their gifts and their resources to help others, and eventually all of them coming together would make for a better community and a better society. That was what the superhero was all about. And I feel that at DC Comics they have gotten far, 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 far away because from this concept. Because again, the people at the top again don't have any publishing experience. They don't understand how the universe model works. They don't understand the history of the comic. They don't understand the story models of the comic. They don't understand you know what these characters are, what their spirit is, and what they truly are about. And this is why a lot of writers have a hard time, telling stories with them because they haven't done the research on the characters. They haven't really taken a look at their history, and they really don't know how to add stories on. This is why the DC universe completely fell apart, starting in 2004 because when they came brought in this New York Times best-selling author. Now he might have been a comic fan and all that stuff, but he didn't understand that how the model worked and how one story relates to another, and how when you have one story that you add onto that story, you have to add on to that story because a writer usually has to build on what other writers have left, and if a writer has left you a whole bunch of bad stories, then you have nothing to work with, and when you have these bad stories, it really becomes frustrating and becomes harder and harder to work with when you're killing off characters in events like your Infinite Crisis or your Identity Crisis. That leads to problems later on because you might want a writer like myself may want to use a character later on, or there might have been a way for me to use that character to solve a problem later on, or they might have been, you know, integral to what happened previously, might have been integral to what happened now. And this is what happens when you have guys who are focused mostly on gimmick storytelling, and they just want to shock people, but they don't understand that how each character connects with every other character in a universe, and that's something you really have to understand. That um, when you kill off a character or you maim a character or injure a character, it has ramifications on other characters. That was something I learned the hard way back in 2002 when I killed off the East Team character in ISIS. I just thought at the time, it's a villain. I'm never going to use her again. And we're going to move on to the next story. And I had to look at myself and say, this is a good character. There's a lot of story left in her. And I really haven't told her complete story. And that's when I brought her back in the Politics of Hell. And her story really started to grow, and she's became an essential character in the SJS Direct universe because I took the East Team character and I literally put her through a character transformation arc. She went from this bad guy with ISIS and the first ISIS, and then in the Politics of Hell, and then I said, you know what, this ISIS versus East Team feud has pretty much run its course. It's gonna, if I keep it going, it's gonna be like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, where they keep fighting the same bad guy, and the character's really not going to grow. And then when I came up with the idea for the Temptation of John Haynes, um, this book, the character began a complete total character transformation as I explored her father issues, her relationship with Lucifer, her relationship with John Haynes, and eventually the character went from a villainous at the start of Temptation of John Haynes to becoming a heroine. And then after I started the ISIS series in 2013 with Amari's Revenge, I then decided to bring the East Team character and let her have her own stories. And right now, she's the second most popular character in the SJS Direct catalog. when I put her books up on Smashwords, they get at least 50 to 100 downloads on the first day. And that was all, that was a learning process for me to see that, you know, what happens when you kill a character off and you don't really think about it. You just think, oh, that's a throwaway character. And then it turns out this is the character that's leading, one of the leaders in the brand, because I put the character through that character transformation process. And this is something what happens when, if you don't, not a good writer or a good person with good publishing experience, you don't really see how to transform those characters and take them to the next level. Because when you're a creative person, you learn, and I had to learn the hard way, that sometimes there's a great character there, and all it takes is one good story to elevate that character to the next level. And those characters aren't getting that development right now with DC Comics, um, due to all of these gimmicks and shock events and stunts. And because you really, in order to develop a character, a creator really needs that space just to have a run, event free, gimmick free. And they just need a place to just tell their stories straight, because that's how comics were sold in the 70s, the 60s, the 80s, the 40s, and the 50s. And when you have space to just tell your stories, the character can start standing out on their own, and they can start finding their audience. And that's something that I've seen even in writing fantasy, like the ISIS series or the East series, is that when you give a character that space, to tell their own stories, and this is what I'm not seeing, with your Supermans, your Batmans, your Green Lanterns, they're all stuck in these big, long, events that really prevent characters from growing and becoming their own people. And that's because, again, when your editorial at the top doesn't understand how to navigate a universe, or even how the building blocks work in a universe, it prevents all of the characters from growing or forming relationships, or even people discovering characters, because that all requires, a specialized type of skill. And that type of skill is only built when you've been writing for a long time and you've learned, the different techniques and the different crafts of writing. And again, when I look at the DC universe, it's a decade and a half of dysfunction, because, almost, because again, death is not a plot device. I mean, I look at death now in comics, and when I see a death, I just become indifferent to it, because I know that this is just something that a writer is doing to keep from developing an organic conclusion to a story. And or it's a gimmick meant to get people's attention, very quickly. And that's not what storytelling is all about. When you're doing the story, you really want to build to an organic conclusion that really satisfies the reader and gets them anticipating the next book or the next story. And excuse me, I'll just but you really want to get them anticipating that next story. You really want to get them excited. And with most comics, people just I hear a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and that's not what you really want. What you want is what I saw with the Marvel Studios movies. You really want that excitement. You want people, getting ready, anticipating, you want that. You want people saying, I'm ready to go watch this. You really want everybody together. And I look at what's happening in DC with all of this, death, gore, gimmicks, and I don't see the excitement. I don't see the enthusiasm. I remember being a comic fan back in the 80s and going to Comic Cons, in 89, 90, 91, and even going to New York Comic Con. And I was at a DC Universe Classics presentation, and the energy was different. But when I look at comics today, I don't see that energy. I mean, you really want that sense of unity in a brand. And I look at DC's editorial management right now, and they're not really bringing that excitement. I mean, when you go to a con and people are on the panel, people should be excited. Instead, they're just sitting there asking questions, and these guys are sitting there aloof and indifferent. That's not the energy you want in a con at a panel when you're launching, especially when you're launching a product like your so-called New 52. where people are frustrated, they're asking a bunch of hard questions. That's not what you want. What you want is that togetherness. You want that excitement. You want people to be passionate enough to the point where they're going to go out and buy all of these comics. And this is one of the detriments, of shock and awe stunts, is that it fragments the audience. You have half the audience sitting at home, and the other half, they may try a few issues, but then 3 months later or 6 months later, they're walking away because they're not seeing anything satisfying from it. And this is one of the big problems of the, as I call it, the Dido era at DC Comics, is that there's no unity, there's no excitement, there is no enthusiasm, there's no passion, there's no heart, and you need those things when you're selling comics, and you need, you know, that to bring the casuals in, because these are the casuals look at comics, because comics have become so insular. I mean, even though people are watching superhero movies and watching superhero TV shows like Arrow and The Flash, they've become so insular that people aren't coming in, and that long term hurts brands like your DC Comics, because if people aren't reading the stories from today, then it's going to be harder to adapt the stories later on tomorrow and keeping these characters fresh and relevant. And when you have a whole bunch of dark and gritty stuff, it's hard to bring, new customers in, especially youngsters, because I've heard from so many Facebook groups, um, all over, and so many message boards, and I've heard from so many fathers and mothers who say, I want to get my kids into comics. I want to share, superheroes with them. And I can't do that because when I go to a comic book store, it's just graphic, gory violence. Or in the case of some other parents I've heard say, I just can't find them. Because that's another big problem with comics today, is that the distribution model, again, is obsolete. Everything is just, again, insular, just the comic shops, and we really need to get back to the newsstands. Really need to get back to the bookstores. I really feel that comic artists and writers really have to take a time. Go to a Barnes and Noble, do a signing, sit down and talk to different readers. Get them really enthusiastic and excited about their brands and the characters that they create. And this is this is another reason why I do videos myself, is because I really want to get people, excited about characters like Isis and John Haynes and Easteam, and I really want to get people excited about them, and I really want them to, go out and try the stories and, take a good look at them and read them, and even if they like them, just pass it on. And sometimes the positive energy you have, that gets people excited, and that gets them to go out and try, the books. And that's not something that's happening at DC Comics, because again, they're still in the 1990s model, and in the 2008, 2000, post 2008 model, you really have to focus on getting people excited about your brand. You really have to get people enthusiastic about your brand, and you really have to, bring people together. And I saw that togetherness with Iron Man in 2008. I saw it with the Avengers, and I believe that togetherness can happen for DC Comics, but it requires them to go at things with a different approach to business. And their approach to business, to me, is just not working. I look at the way that Superman movie was, Man of Steel. Again, another angry, bitter, somber, almost Dark Knight-esque. It just doesn't work. You really want to bring people together. You really want to get them excited. You want that positive energy like they had with the Avengers, Iron Man, Captain America, the Winter Soldier. You really need that togetherness, and the DC brand needs to do that to bring those comic fans together. And I don't see that happening, in the comic division, the publishing division with the Dido era. I don't really see it with Warner Brothers. And they need a new approach, because this decade and a half of dysfunction, is holding them back, because I really believe in competition. And when you have good competition, it really helps, bring more people into the comic hobby and really bring the business back to the comic hobby. Because I always believe that the comic hobby can come back, but it requires a different approach, because everybody thinks that it's just going to happen, with one big issue, like your Giant Size X-Men #1, or your Superman #1, or some big event like your Crisis of Infinite Earths. And I understand, That's not going to happen in a post 2008 publishing world. No one event is going to do it. It's going to require, like I've been doing over the past decade, it's going to require, a lot of digging in the trenches, doing a lot of hard work, just pushing in spite of all of the obstacles in front of you. It's going to be a major challenge in rebuilding a brand like your DC Comics or even your Marvel Comics on the publishing side. It's going to be a lot of work. And it's going to be like what Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had to do, and even other people had to do. They're going to go through a lot of lean years and a lot of pain, and you're going to have to really hang in there with a title. I mean, there were books that I have done that I had to hang in there with, and people came back and they started discovering them, and that's going to be a big part of rebuilding a DC Comics brand. And we really need a vision to rebuild that brand, because I believe that the character catalog is still there. I believe that that you can rebuild the DC universe, but it's just the way it's been executed under this mismanaged leadership that is preventing it from growing. I believe that the characters are there. I believe that there are a lot of great creators that I see on the indie market and the webcomics world. If they were brought into DC Comics, they could have a big impact. That they have fresh stories and fresh ideas, and I believe that comics can make that big comeback and move out of this slump. But it requires, a person with vision and publishing experience to do that and bring that, brand back. Because I look at it at the New 52, I looked at a lot of things. I said they were building the universe too fast. I mean, they were just trying to slap it together. And you can't slap a universe together again. Universes have to be built over a period of years. It usually takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to build a universe. You have to start with not 52 titles, but you're going to have to start with maybe 3 titles to start, like your Superman, your Batman, and your Wonder Woman. Then you add in your Flash, your Green Lantern, and your Aquaman. And then you might have a Martian Manhunter popping up in the back of an Action Comics or Detective Comics. And then from there, you bring in your Shazam and other characters. And then at the end of the first year, you bring your Justice League together. And they take on whatever big menace is, and it leads to the formation of that team. And then you launch that title. Because when I looked at the New 52, they started with Justice League when it really should have been, just like I described a minute ago, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, then 3 months later, Flash, Green Lantern, and Aquaman. And then from there, you just build, that's how you build a universe. And then at the end of that first year, you launch the Justice League title. And then from there, year 2, you come in with your Green Arrow, your Firestorm, your Blue Beetle, and that's how you build a universe. Because that's how I built a universe. I started with ISIS, and then I brought East Steam in, then I brought in John Haynes. And then, to bring ISIS back into the modern period, I brought in the Thetas, and that established the continuity. And then in ISIS, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, in this book, ISIS finally met John Haynes, and that led to the core foundation of the, SJS Direct Universe. And in this recent book I'm doing, ISIS Night of the Vampires, ISIS teams up with John Haynes. So that's how I built a universe, and that's how universes are built. The same thing can be said for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which was built the same way, which was Iron Man in 2008, the Hulk came out, then Thor, then Captain America, and all 4 of those movies led to the formation of the Avengers. And then from there, after they had that movie, came Captain America, The Winter Soldier, and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was sort of like the way I did Politics of Hell. It's a series that, bridges some of the gaps. And then all that leads, and then Guardians of the Galaxy came out, and then all of that leads to Avengers Age of Ultron. And you can see how the universe is built. It's built over time with different series, and that wasn't done with this New 52. New 52 was kind of just slapped together, rushed out, and you can't really rush the building of the universe, because I look at the way, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby built the DC universe, Not the DC universe, the Marvel universe. I'm sorry, I'm very, very sorry about that. The Marvel universe. Stanley and Jack Kirby built the Marvel universe. They built it very slowly. Um, Started out with Fantastic Four because the Fantastic Four is a cornerstone of the Marvel universe. Followed up with Spider-Man, the Hulk, Thor, and then from there, the second tier came out, which was Iron Man, Daredevil. I think this is where all I got from Origins of Marvel Comics and Son of Origins from Marvel Comics, and they built it very slowly. It took years to build a universe, and it takes years to, you know, build those build it so you can navigate all the worlds of the different characters. And you really need a qualified person to build that universe, and I can honestly say that's not Dan Dido or Diane Nelson or Jim Lee or Bob Harris. They're just not qualified, you know, to to rebuild the DC universe. These guys, they created a decade and a half of dysfunction in DC, and they had to use these gimmicks that were already outdated way back in 1993. I mean, the whole deaths, new costumes, all that stuff that went out of date with the death of Superman, and because the death of Superman was one of the events that led to the total collapse of the comic book industry, and it's just time, as I see it, you know, for a new approach to comics and a new approach to business, something that fits more within the 21st century model of publishing and, relates to kids of today, because we really need a lot of these characters can be adapted because their stories are great, and the values that they originally taught are the values that families want to continue teaching their kids, because I always see comics as a modern mythology, and they can be added on and built on, but it just requires seasoned craftspeople who understand how to do this. And I look at the DC Comics and how they're you know withdrawing and trying to go to Hollywood because they said they moved their publishing offices from New York to LA. That's not really going to help you know get a new generation of readers into comics. All it's going to do is further establish the disconnect. Now they're thinking that it's going to lead to more synergy between the characters and the brand, but really it's going to just lead to a further disconnect because um, when you have everybody in California, nobody's talking to the people in New York. I mean, the publishing world is here in New York, and if you want to sell books, you have to be here. You can't be in any other part of the country because this is how it's done. This is how books are promoted. This is how books are sold. This is where books are sold, and this is where marketing campaigns for books are done. And in order to sell these characters, you really need good storytellers. And most of the storytellers, again, live here in New York. Some live in other parts of the country, but when you really want to promote books, this is where it's done. This is where people move here just to become writers, and they move here to become artists. And I don't really see the move as helping things. I think it's going to regress them and prevent them from growing. And it's sad because, again, this DC Comics brand can be rebuilt and it can move forward from this decade and a half of dysfunction and really start competing with Marvel Comics and Marvel Studios. Because Marvel Studios has really made a lot of progress with maintaining the heart and soul of their characters and maintaining and telling those great stories. And I look at, a movie like Man of Steel. I even look at the Dark Knight trilogy. I know some people love those movies, but I really don't see Batman in them. I really don't see the spirit of Batman in them. It's just too angry. I mean, it's just too angry for me, and that's not really what Batman, as I see, is not a balanced Batman. It's just too angry, too cynical, and just too mean. And I look at Man of Steel again, another angry movie. And that's not what superheroes are. Superheroes are bright, they're fun, they help kids navigate the world, and they help brighten people's days. And this is what is really needed, to come back to the DC Comics brand. I don't see that happening, on the publishing side with Dan Dido and Diane Nelson running the brand. I don't see fun coming back there. I just see a lot of anger and cynicism, and that really needs to leave comics. I mean, we really need a different type of comic at DC for the 2010s and even the 2020s, and we need a new approach to comics. And things have to change over there. I really believe something has to give. I wonder how much market share Warner Brothers has to lose, or do they have to see another, movie like your Superman versus Batman flop in order for them to get it. But the brand really needs a new direction, a new vision for leadership, and a new approach to things. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up, books like Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. This one is in paperback, and it's on Kindle Unlimited. So if you have Amazon Prime, you can borrow Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess and other books in the Isis series, like Isis All About the Goddess, Isis Power of the Princess, and you can also pick up The Temptation of John Haynes on Kindle Unlimited if you have Amazon Prime for free. And I have other books in the Isis series available on paperback and on Kindle. Amari's Revenge is on paperback and Kindle. You can just pick that one up for 99 cents. And there are a lot of great stories in the Isis series. Every story follows the same paradigm of old school comic books, in which every story is an entry point. Every story has its own beginning, middle, and end. And every story is accessible, and you can pick up one story at the end of the series, and go back to the beginning, or you can go back into this, or you can go to the beginning with the first Isis book from 2002 here, and start following the timeline all the way to the end. Again, that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.